great reporting, interesting story. It does feel like, though, increasingly we're in this world where these big tech giants want to make and are making their own semiconductors. Tell us about Google, because they've been, designing chips for over a decade, but what's interesting about what they are doing right now?
So first of all, you've mentioned in a matter of months. Let's talk about what's likely to happen in a matter of days. Later this week is Google's next conference in Las Vegas, and as we reported in our story, they are likely to announce at that conference that they are releasing a version of their chip, a TPU, for inferencing workloads. So inferencing is when you've already got an AI model that's trained and you need to run it. You need to enable it to answer people's questions quickly. So we're reporting they're probably going to announce a TPU for inferencing. And that would sort of, as you mentioned, individual companies doing things, some of what's gone on in the last couple of months also is this focus on, low latency or very fast inferencing. So if we're getting into a world where people are looking at agents and things that need to be more conversational, you want to be able to answer those queries quickly. And so last month we had Nvidia, which is obviously the giant, the dominant player, releasing a fast inference chip based on the technology they acquired from Grok. I know, Cerebras just filed their IPO. They're also in this fast inferencing space. And so now we're expecting that Google is going to get more fully into that space with a chip that's specific for that task. Whereas up until now, as Nvidia had in the past, Google's been, using one set of TPU model for both training and inferencing. So that's what we're expecting, later this week. And Google's chief scientist, Jeff Dean, told me in an interview, look, there's all this demand growing for fast inferencing. And he said, quote, it now becomes sensible to specialize chips more for training or more for inference workloads. That said, the head of their chip division, Vidot, declined to say specifically what they're going to do later this week. But, he did say that more will be shared, quote, in the relatively near future.
Okay, so before we get to the relatively near future, we're here in the now, and we have what you've reported, which is just absolutely amazing. And I'm curious about Nvidia and the competition that this could or potentially would pose to Nvidia, which, as you mentioned, and we all know, is the market leader when it comes to this stuff.
So I think you have to remember that it's not just that NVIDIA is the market leader. Everyone uses NVIDIA. That everyone includes Google. Google's latest Gemini model, however, which has been very well reviewed and very successful, was trained and on TPU and uses TPU for inference. Now, last week there was a podcast with NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang and Dorkesh Patel, in which Jensen talked about the TPU threat and said, look, the growth in TPU is all Anthropic, which is a huge, obviously a huge Google TPU customer. But, Jensen's argument was, look, this is not a phenomenon. It's a one-off customer. I spoke to Demis, Google DeepMind CEO, and he pushed back on that. He said a lot of customers do want to do what Google does, which is use both GPU and TPU. And in fact, the problem for Google is that they don't quite have enough supply to meet that. We talk in the story about some other customers, about Meta, about Citadel Securities. But, Demis's comment is that they don't have enough supply to meet all the interest. And so for now, at least, they're prioritizing the really high-end, frontier model teams who he said really are, best able, best skilled to take advantage of the, the advantages that TPU brings. And then, we talked a lot about what those advantages are. I think from Google's point of view, what helps them is the fact that they co-design the TPU chips with both the hardware team and the folks at Google who work on those leading AI models. And that gives them a view into what you need to successfully, design a chip that trains and inferences great models. It also helps them see problems more quickly, they argued to me.
Does NVIDIA need to be worried here, Dina?
NVIDIA is still the dominant player. Everyone that I talk to expects them to be the dominant player for the foreseeable future. I don't know that I think there's a different metric of success for Google TPU and NVIDIA. NVIDIA success looks like continuing to dominate the market, starting to pick up some of these newer growing workloads in a significant way, such as the fast inference. TPU is coming from a place of being so much smaller in terms of share. It's really more a question of, can they pick up some share? But also even more than that, they have to decide what they want to do and what they want to be. Nvidia sells chips for companies to use in their own data centers in whatever way that they want. Google has thus far almost exclusively focused on giving you access to TPUs through their own cloud. Now they're starting to experiment with some other models. Anthropic, for example, has been able to, do with Google some experiments where they're running TPUs for Anthropic in data centers that Anthropic controls rather than through Google Cloud. But Google has to figure out, do they want to be a chip seller like Nvidia? That's not tied to their cloud? And then also with that limited supply, how do they allocate between customers who want a certain amount and not everyone can get what they want, as well as all of the Google workloads that are using the TPUs and, including Gemini, including Google Search. That's also a question. They sort of have to figure out where they want the business to go. It's not quite the same thing as Nvidia.
Why, and we only have about 30 seconds left, Dina, but why sort of this identity question? Like, why wouldn't Google try to do both things really well?
I think it's just a question of where they want to go and where they want to invest. Nvidia is, a chip company that also does some AI models, and they do some of Nvidia's AI models are increasingly excellent. They're very open source focused, but they're a chip company coming at that space. Google is a company in a lot of different areas, including, cloud and search and AI models before they're a chip company. I think they have to figure out what the chip portion, where that fits in and how it helps them.
Sounds like TBD, and let's see what we get out of the announcement. What are your, just real quickly, 10 seconds, the announcement, so just the devil in the details, or what?
I think we'll have to see what they say and when they're available. And, again, this is, Next starts on Wednesday. So keep your eyes peeled for what they say.